We're in your United States history book. We're in chapter 11, section 3, President Jackson to President Van Buren. So we were going from the 7th President of the United States to the 8th President of the United States. Both Jackson and Van Buren are considering the Jacksonian administration. They both had similar policies, and I have to say there's one policy that they don't hold that's similar, and that is on slavery. We'll find that later on. But we're going to go over what happened during Van Buren's administration, right? The rise of the Whig Party, the election of 1836. What about the anti-Mason Party? Have you ever heard of that? Anti-Freemasons? They were actually our first third party. Can you believe that? So on to the National Depression and how the nation went through this depression time due to what was going on with the National Bank and just that economy going in its cyclic motion. So here's some pictures of Martin Van Buren, President of the United States, number 8. He was born December 5th, 1782. Birthplace Kinderhook, New York. He died on July 24th, 1862. It's like about when the Civil War was going on, huh? He was of the Democratic Party. His vice president was Richard Mentor Johnson, and he was inaugurated when he's 54. It's 54 there. So some pictures of Martin Van Buren. So, and we're going on here, and this will go on to the panic that happened during his time as president. The rise of the Whig Party. So you're going to wonder, who were the Whigs? Well, let's look up this little corner here. It says the Whigs were founded by John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, and these were opponents of Andrew Jackson. So they were pro-business and industry and manufacturing. They were former Federalists, and the states' rights of the Southerners angered during this time too. So they actually joined up with the Whigs too. Basically, the Whigs were anti-Andrew Jackson, President Andrew Jackson's policies, right? So with the Whig, they took their name from back in time of England when the Whigs stood up against the king. So, and they would call Andrew Jackson King Andrew at this time in a lot of different ways. He stood up as a very authoritarian leader. So, but anyway, the rise of the Whig Party came out of the resistance to Jackson politics. They were resisting Jackson politics. And this was a new formed party. And it was formed, actually, the anti-Mason Party ended up joining the Whigs later on. You'll find that. And even the Democrats, a lot of Democrats joined with the National Republicans and the Whigs too. So anybody that was against Jackson would join with the Whigs. Henry Clay was a leader, and he denounced Andrew Jackson. The Whigs name, like we said, came from those that opposed the monarchy, and they opposed King Andrew Jackson, right? They called him. So they felt like Andrew Jackson was like a monarch or a king. So, and here we have, we're going to go in, we're going to be talking about the election of 1836 with Van Buren receiving 170 electoral votes, and the Whig Party was split. The Panic of 1837 would cause a lot of problems from the Van Buren administration, right? This panic that went on. And on to the next election of 1840, where Van Buren would lose to Tippecanoe in Tyler too. And we'll talk about that later on. So let's get going. The election of 1836. The presidential election of 1836 here was Martin Van Buren, who represented Jackson's policies, and a whole bunch of Whigs. And that's going to be a problem because the Whigs are going to be all divided into certain sections there. So we're going to have William Henry Harrison. We have a Daniel Webster. We have all these Whigs, and which one would run? So anyway, President Jackson retires from his second term. He decides not to run again. And he's endorsed by Martin Van Buren. And Martin Van Buren is a New Yorker, and he has the unanimous support of President Jackson. And due to the Whig Party being pretty disorganized, as you can see, and they also had the anti-Mason Third Party coming in, pretty much split up the Whigs into a lot of different factions, right? So, of course, Martin Van Buren, of course, would win. He won the presidency in 1836. Martin Van Buren was a Mason, so he wasn't in the anti-Mason group. In fact, a lot of the people that were anti-Mason would call him very dangerous and demonic and corrupt. And I don't know if he's all these things or what it was his degree in the Freemasons or in all this, but he was despised by a lot of the Whigs and the anti-Mason party, and because he represented Andrew Jackson, which they didn't like. But Van Buren's presidency was pretty much cursed from the start. Why? Because of the economic panic of 1837. Everybody running to the bank, trying to get their money out of the bank, the discrepancy with the national bank, how much the federal bank was controlled by Europe, and all these things were going on, as I talked about in our last video. And so out of this panic, of course, would come a depression. And who would everybody blame it on? Of course, the presidency. And who was the presidency? Martin Van Buren. This is called the bizarre election of 1836. Why was it so bizarre? Because all these Whigs came out in the midst of all of this. And of course, it was so divided that the bizarre fact would be that Martin Van Buren would win, right? So anyway, Martin Van Buren would fight the economy as best he knew. He had to deal with this falling economy, this depression coming in. So it'd be a hard time for him as president. Okay, we're taking a little sidetracked here about these anti-Masons. Why were they so anti-Freemasons, and what were the Freemasons? Well, the Freemasons were this secret club that certain men got together, and it's throughout history, went way back in history, and that they'd get together, just to discuss politics and everything, especially if they didn't go to church. It was actually just a social group, but it got to be more than that, and they got into all these secret things and secret oaths that they would take, and on and on. But what happened that really put many people in the country against the Masons was a murder of a guy that stood up against them. And so let's talk about this a little bit. In 1826, this man here named William Morgan, he was a former Mason, and he decided to get out of and called it a cult, and basically get out of it and stand up against their policies and practices. And he wanted to debunk that whole secret society and say, it's not what you think it is. It's underlined with cultish things, religious things, satanic things. And so he wrote a book about it and all this secret society and what they did in this secret society. And suddenly, William Morgan would disappear. He was seen being drugged into this carriage, and he was yelling, "Murderers, murderers!" when they were dragging him away. But before this, he had been put in jail, and he put in jail for trumped up charges of stealing a tie and a shirt. And they put him in jail, and then from that point, somebody came that he didn't know that bailed him out of jail. And the tavern owner had been witness, and he saw them take him out of jail and put him in a carriage, and that's when they saw him yelling. And they had also kidnapped his printer, but later returned his printer and let his printer go, but printed up his book or his pamphlets on against the Masons. So there were later on 50 Masons that were tried and convicted of kidnapping. So they said they did kidnap him, but they said they didn't murder him, that they just let him go somewhere in Canada and don't know where he went. So, and they never did find William Morgan, and he had a wife and 2 daughters, I think 2 daughters. So they basically, thought, well, of course he would come back for his wife, but nobody ever saw him. So this up here is William Hurt, and he's going to be against of the Democratic anti-Masons. He's going to be the head of the anti-Masons. But let's go on with this story, because it gets even. I put this side note in because when I was investigating this, I came up with something else. So later on, a Mason confessed as he was dying. He had his confession. He said he was part of a plot to kill William Morgan, and that he had actually pushed him off into the Niagara River. Niagara Falls are there, and pushed him off with some weights on. And so he basically had killed William Morgan. And later on, they found a body, and his wife said, oh, yes, that's him, because she identified by his teeth. But then the wife was threatened, and she said, no, that's not him. So that went on. But later on, I found if Morgan's wife, her name was Lucinda Pendleton, and it's in Wikipedia, you could look it up, and her children, they were actually taken in later on by the Masons. You can imagine. They were destitute, so the Masons came on, and she married a Mason named George Washington Harris, and they lived in Nauvoo, Illinois. It's kind of important because something else happened here, if you look up her name, because she is in the list of Mormon wives to Joseph Smith. Do you know who Joseph Smith was? The beginning of the Church of Latter-day Saints, the Mormon Church. He's the very beginning. So him and his brother both were diehard Freemasons. And you'll see all of the cultish things that they did in the Freemasons, they also do what? In the Mormon Church. They're very similar today. So it was written there that Joseph Smith, he's the one that founded Mormonism. He lived at the Harris house where he had secret marriages, and he married her. She was already married, but he had a secret marriage with her. And in fact, during that time period, before and after that time period, 28 other women, young and old, he married them all because he felt like he was marrying these secret marriages, that he would be able to have these women on his secret planets later on in eternity, or what, as they believe in their secret marriages. So, and Joseph Smith and his brothers were diehard Freemasons, and they and they took the Masons and made it into the Mormon cult. Now, you can say whatever you want. People can say to whatever they want to say, oh, this is not true. But if you look in detail to their secret societies, they're very similar. So, but I just found that very interesting with Lucinda, William Morgan's wife, going to the Freemasons and becoming Mormon wife of Joseph Smith is very crazily ridiculous, but it happened. So now going back to under anti-Mason sentiment, we have the Second Great Awakening, this evangelist, Charles Finney. He was a man that was with the Freemasons, so he was in the Freemasons, but then he came and accepted Jesus as his Lord and Savior. And gradually he just denounced Freemasonry as a cult. And he wrote a book on their secrets and their societies and the reasons that a true Christian should not be involved with Masons, with Freemasonry. And so he wrote a big book, and you can look that up and read that. I started reading some of it, and the reasons he put are very much, what they do in their secret cults. And the secret cult of Freemasons is very, I would say very demonic, Luciferian and stuff, Illuminati type, But anyway, he brings this out, and he doesn't get kidnapped or killed. But as a Christian, he stands against when he was involved in this. So President John Quincy Adams, he was the one first to denounce Freemasons and said, basically, this is a cult and we don't want to be involved in it. We shouldn't have anybody in our political realm should not be Freemasons. So he stood up against, and many others did too. So many others that they had a whole party of Freemasons, or anti-Masons, anti-Masons. At this time, everyone was angry because they heard about the murder of William Morgan. And so they thought, what's going on? So these Freemason places where they'd get together, their meetings and stuff, and what I can't remember the name they call them, but the Freemasons, as they got together in their groups and such, would be less and less and less. And people were standing up against being involved with the Freemasons at this time. But Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren had been outspoken Freemasons. Now, I don't know if they just got together, and, for camaraderie or social club, or if they were really involved. So I can't really stand for either one of those guys. But I know that towards the end of his life, before his death, that President Jackson actually became a Christian. So anyway, going on, it's written here, this was Charles Finney's writings. In 1792 to 1875 is when he lived. He said, the time has come that Christians must vote for honest men and take consistent ground in politics, or the Lord will curse them. Christians seem to act as if they thought God did not see what they do in politics. But I tell you, he does see it, and he will bless or curse this nation accordingly to the course that Christians take in politics. So he's saying, yeah, we shouldn't be voting for those people that we think, basically those people that were involved in some of these things in politics. So he's standing up during this time as an evangelist and preacher, and the nation is under this anti-Mason sentiment now. Also, in spite of all of this, a national depression's going on. And that's when we're going to have this second great awakening. A depression's going on. People are looking onto the corruption in politics. They're wondering what's going to happen next. They've seen the murder of involved in this Masons and everything. Seeing all these things, and in the midst of this, they're having a depression. Their money is inflated, not worth anything, and things going on. So it's no longer the era of good feelings of James Monroe or even of Jackson's time. Van Buren's administration was very, very difficult. The financial panic that was led actually by Andrew Jackson's specie circular, when you remember he said that you had to pay gold for everything, and people didn't have gold. If you went to buy land, you'd better pay gold for it. And so people didn't get gold from the banks. They had no gold. And there was a crop shortage on top of this. And the inflation, their money wasn't worth hardly anything, led to depression. And this set the entire economy into a tailspin of going through depression in America and Europe. Even in Europe, they went into a depression too during this time. It's kind of a cycle it goes through, but the cycle was great considering what was done in the midst of all of this with the federal bank. The federal banks actually during this time, the very wealthy people made a lot of money because they're the only ones that had money, so they would buy up everything during the Depression, and later on, when the money would be worth something, they would own a lot, and that's how they've made their money. And lending, and also lending money, they would basically lend money to countries, and then the countries would be indebted to them. But anyway. So President Van Buren, he believed in laissez-faire like Jefferson. Basically, the states should have more control than the federal government. And he persuaded Congress to establish an independent federal treasury in 1840 that was independent of the federal government. And the government would not be able to, the government will not deposit money in the private banks like they did under Jackson, though. So he's trying to figure this out, how they can do this, because the banks were going bankrupt, right? The banks were closing their doors. So the private banks had used government funds to back their bank notes. And so now he saw there was corruption in the state banks. And the new treasury system would keep this from happening and avoid crisis. So he wanted to put together a new type of treasury that wouldn't be totally based on the federal government. So going on, it says, while in office, Van Buren continued the Indian Removal Acts. Remember, he continued to remove the Indians, which was pretty much an atrocity, especially the Cherokee Nation. It led to the infamous, terrible Trail of Tears. So, and this picture here, that's his wife. She actually died in 1819, way before he became president. So Van Buren was a widow all of his times in politics, really. And this is his daughter-in-law. She would be the first lady. His sons came and lived in the White House with him. He had 4 sons that were living. And one of his sons married the I would say it was a niece or a relative of Dolly Madison, actually. And she became, when you think Dolly Madison, she became very important as keeping everything as for like a first lady would do in the White House. And it was his daughter-in-law. Okay, Martin Van Buren. I'm just going to read some of this here. So you can just read it with me here. So it says, Martin Van Buren was the 8th president of the United States, 1837 to 1841. After serving as the 8th vice president and the 10th secretary of state, both under President Andrew Jackson, he became the 8th president of the United States. While the country was prosperous, they called him a little magician. Isn't that weird? They called him a little magician. And he was elected less than 3 months later. After he was elected, that financial panic happened. So everything was fine, then suddenly it wasn't. And so in 1837, pretty much punctured all the prosperity of the country. He was only about 5 feet tall, 5 feet 6 inches tall, but he was trim and erect, and Martin Van Buren dressed fastidiously. He was well dressed, and his impeccable appearance belied his amiability and his humble background, because his background was he came out of poverty, actually, and he was of Dutch descent. He was from, basically his family came from the Netherlands, and he was born in 1782, the son of a tavern keeper and a farmer in Kinderhook, New York. That's where he came from. He married Hannah Hose, who bore him 5 children. One of the boys died. 4 of them lived and ended up with him in the White House. And she died of tuberculosis in 1819 at the age of only 35 years old when she died. And then he remained a widower after that. And of course, their son Abraham married Dolly Madison's relative, Angela Simpleton, and she became the first lady. There she is right there. As a young lawyer, he became involved in the New York politics and as a leader of the Albany Regency. It was an effective New York political organization, and he shrewdly dispensed public office and bounty in a fashion calculated to bring votes. So he was very good at what he was doing as a lawyer. The little magician was elected vice president under the Jackson ticket, as we know, and then he won the president. We already know that in 1836. Van Buren devoted his inaugural address to a discourse upon the American experiment as an example to the rest of the world. The country was prosperous, but less than 3 months later, there was the panic of 1837. So, Martin Van Buren. The Van Buren administration. Well, programs applied decades later to alleviate the economic crisis. They wanted to alleviate this depression. Eluded both Van Buren and his opponents. They couldn't really get it made. They couldn't really get the depression under control. Van Buren's remedy was continuing Jackson's deflationary policies And this only made things worse and prolonged the Depression. And during that panic was due to the recklessness in business and overexpansion of credit. Van Buren devoted himself to maintaining the solvency of the national government. So he basically didn't want to have the government have very much power at all. And he opposed not only the creation of a new bank, he didn't want a new bank, but he also the placing of government funds in state banks. So he didn't want to put in state banks either. So he fought for the establishment of an independent treasury system to handle the government transactions. He wanted something independent of the state banks and independent of the government banks. So this is going to be quite a deal. So as for federal aid to the internal improvements, he cut off expenditures so completely that the government even sold the tools it had used on public works. So he didn't want the central government to have control financially at all. So he sold everything. So he didn't want the government to go in debt. He inclined more and more to oppose the expansion of slavery. So that's one thing he didn't do that Jackson didn't do, that he did. He was Martin Van Buren was against slavery. He was from New York and he was against slavery. And so Van Buren blocked the annexation of Texas because he thought that Texas would come in and be a slave state, a slave territory. And then it also might bring a war with Mexico. So he thought, we don't need another slave state. So, and of course, he was defeated by the Whigs in 1840 for re-election, and he was an unsuccessful candidate for the president on the free soil ticket. The free soil ticket would actually be an anti-slavery ticket against slavery, and he died in 1862. So that's Martin Van Buren. Let's go back to the Panic of 1837. So the panic hit very hard and very fast, and the banks closed and stopped payment of gold and silver, prices fell, land sales stopped, laborers were hit the hardest with unemployment, families were hungry, and many people were homeless. And they all ran to get their money out of the bank. Van Buren's financial tactics would be kind of run over. He called a special Congress meeting, and he issued $10 million in treasury notes. But you need a bank to do this, right? So he tried to establish an independent treasury system with funds held by the federal government. So an independent one. So a federal gold and silver to be stored in a vault in the United States Mint. So he said everything is going to be stored in a vault instead of in a bank. And this was approved in 1840 by the Congress. And so these sub-treasuries he put these treasures, took all of the treasury money, put them in these so-called sub-treasury vaults in New York, in Washington, D.C., in Boston, in Philadelphia, in St. Louis, and New Orleans. So he spread all of the gold and silver of the government into all these different sub-treasury vaults, right? Here's a couple things he said. The less government interferes with private pursuits, the better for general prosperity. Martin Van Buren. Remember, Martin Van Buren is a Democrat. The Democrats kind of believe the opposite now. So I like this. As you well know, Mr. President, railroad carriages are pulled by enormous speed of 15 miles per hour. The Almighty certainly never intended that people should travel at such a breakneck speed. So he was like, I think that these carriages are going too fast at 15 miles per hour. Wonder what he would say about cars nowadays. So I'm going to stop right there, and then we're going to go on the second part, which is the New Age in American Politics. And it's chapter 11, section 3.